Dust coated the roof of her mouth like cheap chalk. Down in the jagged valley below, 4 men she'd bled with were trapped behind a crumbling limestone wall, pinned by over 100 enemy fighters. They were out of water, out of air support, and rapidly running out of time. Above them, separated by 1.5 miles of thin, volatile mountain air, Marshall adjusted the elevation dial on her TAC-50 rifle. 2,500 meters, an impossible distance. This wasn't about heroism. It was about cold math, holding your breath, and refusing to let your friends die alone. Grit has a taste. It tastes like old pennies, dried sweat, and pulverized rock. Marshall chewed on it, her jaw tight, as a bead of perspiration charted a slow, agonizing course down the bridge of her nose. She didn't wipe it away. Movement meant compromise. Compromise meant the sniper hide they'd spent 6 hours crawling into would become their tomb. Beside her, Miller breathed through his nose, slow, rhythmic. He smelled sour, a mixture of 3 days of unwashed tactical gear and the sharp tang of adrenaline that never really left your system when you were operating past the wire. He had a spotting scope pressed to his eye, his thick, calloused fingers resting lightly on the focus ring. "Wind is shifting," Miller whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the low moan of the wind cutting through the shale formations. "Half value, coming from the east, maybe 5 miles an hour at our altitude, but down in the bowl—" He let the sentence die. Down in the bowl, the air was a chaotic mess. Thermal updrafts rose off the sun-baked valley floor, creating shimmering mirages that made the distant terrain look like it was melting. It was 110 degrees in the shade, but there was no shade on this ridge. Just blinding, bleached white limestone that reflected the midday sun right into their retinas. Marshall adjusted her cheek weld against the stock of the Macmillan TAC-50. The rifle was a beast, 30 pounds of steel, polymer, and lethal intent. It wasn't a precision instrument of elegant design. It was a sledgehammer, built to throw a massive .50 caliber slug through engine blocks and concrete walls. Right now, it felt like an extension of her own aching collarbone. She wasn't supposed to be here, not historically speaking anyway. The brass had dragged their feet on female SEALs for decades, wrapped up in endless debates about upper body strength and unit cohesion. Marshall hadn't cared about the politics. She just liked the work. She liked the simplicity of a world reduced to windage, elevation, and the exact moment the sear breaks on a trigger. But lying here, her elbows ground raw against the abrasive stone, her bladder aching from holding it for 12 hours. She felt a profound wave of cynical exhaustion. There was no glory on this ridge. Just flies, dehydration, and the lingering fear that they were entirely forgotten by the command post sitting in air-conditioned trailers 200 miles away. "I see them," Miller breathed. Marshall shifted her gaze through the Schmidt and Bender scope. 2 miles away, at the bottom of the geological depression, 4 tiny figures moved through the wadi. Hayes' squad. They were moving in a staggered file, their desert camouflage blending seamlessly with the dust. Through the high-powered glass, they looked like slow-moving insects. "They're bunching up," Marshall muttered, her lips barely moving. "Hayes knows better." "Canyons narrowing," Miller said, his eye never leaving the glass. "No choice. They push through the choke point, or they climb. And they aren't climbing in this heat with 80 pounds of kit." Marshall zoomed in. The crosshairs bisected Hayes. Even from this distance, she could tell his posture was wrong. Shoulders hunched, rifle tight to his chest. He was scanning the ridgelines above them, completely unaware that the real threat wasn't in front of them. It was waiting in the shadows of the caves flanking the western wall. Intelligence had said the valley was clear, a simple transit route to extract a high-value target's lieutenant. Intelligence was, as usual, a work of fiction. The silence stretched. It was that heavy, suffocating quiet that only happens right before the world ends. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermals. Marshall watched a single drop of sweat fall from her eyelash onto the glass of her scope. Then the valley floor erupted. It didn't start with a cinematic explosion. It started with a sound like ripping canvas, followed instantly by the wet, sickening thud of lead hitting meat and stone. "Contact!" Miller barked, all trace of lethargy gone. Down in the wadi, the dust simply exploded. It wasn't one shooter, it wasn't 10. The entire western ridge of the canyon lit up with muzzle flashes, sparkling like dry lightning in the shadows. Through the scope, Marshall watched Dawson, the kid, the radio man who still got nervous around the older guys, get thrown backward. The impact spun him around like a rag doll. His heavy rucksack took the brunt of the burst, but the kinetic energy alone was enough to drop him. "Dawson's hit," Marshall said. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her brain instantly compartmentalized the image of her friend bleeding in the dirt. Threat identification, distance, wind. Hayes was moving before Dawson even hit the ground. He grabbed the kid's drag handle and hurled himself backward behind a low, jagged outcrop of limestone. The other two, Riggs and Carter, laid down immediate suppressive fire, their M4s barking uselessly at the elevated caves hundreds of yards away. It was a futile gesture. You can't suppress what you can't see, and the insurgents were perfectly dug in. "Jesus Christ," Miller hissed. "They walked right into a horseshoe ambush. I'm counting 40, 50 muzzles, more coming out of the goat paths." "Range," Marshall demanded. Miller scrambled with the laser rangefinder. "To the primary cave network, 2,100 meters. Marshall chambered around. The bolt of the TAC-50 slid forward with a heavy metallic clack that sounded deafening in her ears. She found a muzzle flash, dialed her elevation, and exhaled. She squeezed. The rifle bucked violently, driving the stock into her shoulder with the force of a mule kick. The muzzle brake vented gases backward, kicking up a storm of dust that temporarily blinded her. She didn't wait for the dust to settle. She cycled the bolt, ejecting a smoking brass casing the size of a cigar, and reacquired her target. "Miss," Miller said flatly. "Impact high and left. Hit the rock face. You've got a crosswind tearing through the center of the canyon." Marshall cursed silently. A miss at this range wasn't just a wasted bullet, it gave away their position. But the insurgents didn't even notice. They were entirely focused on the slaughter happening in the wadi. Down below, the situation was deteriorating from a clusterfuck into a massacre. The limestone outcrop Hayes and the team were hiding behind was disintegrating. It wasn't cover, it was concealment, and it was failing. Then the real nightmare began. A heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed up the canyon walls, deep enough that Marshall felt it in her chest before she heard it. "DSHK," Miller yelled over the noise. "Heavy machine gun, Eastern Ridge, elevated position. They have total enfilade on Hayes." Marshall tracked right. There it was, a Soviet-era DSHK, 12.7mm heavy machine gun, mounted on a tripod behind a wall of sandbags. The weapon was a monster, firing rounds just as massive as the ones in Marshall's rifle, but fully automatic. The gunner was a big man in a dark tunic, leaning into the spade grips, holding the trigger down in long, sweeping bursts. The rounds hit the wadi floor like miniature artillery shells. Chunks of rock the size of softballs were blasted into the air. Riggs, trying to return fire, caught a piece of shrapnel, or maybe a ricochet, to the face. Through the scope, Marshall saw the spray of crimson paint the rock behind him. Riggs dropped his rifle, clutching his face, screaming something the radio wouldn't pick up. "Overwatch, this is Viper 1, Hayes's voice crackled in their earpieces. He sounded out of breath, terrified, and painfully human. "We are pinned. We have multiple casualties. Taking heavy fire from an elevated DSHK. If that gun doesn't stop, we are dead in 3 minutes. Do you copy?" Miller pressed his comms button. "Copy, Viper 1. We see it. Working on it." Marshall stared through the glass. The DSHK was positioned on a jagged spur that jutted out over the valley. It was perfectly placed. The gunner had a plunging fire angle that negated whatever meager cover Hayes had left. In 60 seconds, that limestone rock would be chewed down to nothing. "Give me the range on the DSHK, Marshall said. Her hands were perfectly still, but her stomach was tied in cold, agonizing knots. Miller took a breath. He licked his cracked lips. He looked at the laser rangefinder, tapped it as if it were broken, and looked again. "Marshall." "Range, Miller. Now." 2,540 meters. Silence fell over their small patch of high ground. 2,500 meters. It was over 1.5 miles, a distance so extreme that the bullet would be in the air for more than 4 seconds. By the time the round reached the target, the Earth would have literally rotated beneath it. The Coriolis effect. She had to account for spin drift, the natural drift of the bullet caused by its own stabilizing spin. She had to account for barometric pressure, the humidity, and the temperature of the air, which changed drastically between their sun-baked ridge and the shadowed canyon wall where the DSHK sat. Most snipers went their entire careers without attempting a shot past 1,500 meters in combat. A 2,500-meter shot wasn't a skill, it was a lottery ticket bought with physics. "Marshall," Miller said softly, "the drop alone. You'll run out of elevation in the scope. You'll have to hold over. You're aiming at the sky." "I know," she said. Her voice sounded detached, floating somewhere above her body. "Overwatch," Hayes screamed over the radio. In the background, the deafening thump, thump, thump of the DSHK roared. "Dawson is bleeding out. The rock is gone. You have to take that gun out. Fire the damn weapon." Marshall closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She felt a brief, hysterical urge to laugh. Just fire the weapon, as if it were a laser pointer, as if she wasn't about to try and thread a needle in a hurricane while blindfolded. She opened her eyes. The reticle was a harsh black cross against the washed-out colors of the desert. "Walk me in," she told Miller. Miller didn't argue. He knew the odds. He knew the impossibility of it. But he also knew the men dying in the dirt below. "Wind is a nightmare," Miller said, his eye locked on the spotting scope. "You've got 3 different wind zones. Here at the muzzle, it's pushing left to right at 5. Down in the valley, it's swirling. I'm looking at the dust getting kicked up by the DSHK impacts. Wind down there is pushing right to left, maybe 10 miles an hour. "They cancel out?" Marshall asked, her finger resting lightly against the curve of the trigger. "Not entirely. The bullet will slow down as it travels. The wind at the target will push it harder than the wind at the muzzle. Hold, left. 3 mils left." Marshall dialed the windage turret. Click, click, click. "Elevation," she said. Miller consulted his PDA, furiously punching in the variables. "Drop is going to be massive, over 150 feet of bullet drop. Max out your elevation dial." Marshall spun the top turret until it stopped. It wasn't enough. "I'm maxed," she said. "Holding over." She shifted the rifle up. The DSHK gunner disappeared from the center of the crosshairs, dropping down to the very bottom edge of the scope's mil-dot grid. She was literally aiming at a patch of empty blue sky above the cliff. If she pulled the trigger now, she wouldn't even see the target she was shooting at in the center of her glass. "Hold on the fourth mil-dot down," Miller instructed, his voice tight. "That should compensate for the remaining drop. Coriolis will pull you right, so add another half mil to your left hold." Marshall shifted the massive rifle a fraction of a millimeter. Her muscles burned. The stock dug into her shoulder, slick with her own sweat. Her heart was beating entirely too fast. Thump, thump, thump. Every beat caused the reticle to bounce slightly. She tried to employ the breathing techniques they taught at Coronado. Inhale, exhale, pause. But it wasn't working. She wasn't a machine. She was a tired, terrified human being who knew that if she missed this shot, Hayes and the boys would be meat. The DSHK gunner paused to reload. An insurgent beside him slapped a new belt of ammunition into the feed tray. The gunner racked the charging handle, laughing at something his loader said. It was a deeply human gesture that made Marshall sick to her stomach. They were enjoying it. It was target practice to them. "They're flanking us," Carter's voice cracked over the net. He sounded like a frightened teenager. "Hayes is hit. Hayes took one in the leg." "Marshall," Miller said. "It's now or never. Wind is holding. Do it." Marshall exhaled. She let the air leave her lungs slowly, feeling her chest cavity collapse, creating a fleeting moment of stillness in her core. She didn't think about the women who came before her, or the generals who doubted her, or the history books. She thought about the copper smell of blood. She thought about Dawson's laugh. The slack in the two-stage trigger vanished. She found the wall. Just physics, she told herself. She pressed the trigger backward. The world exploded. The TAC-50 roared, a concussive shockwave that kicked up a cloud of white dust around their hide. The recoil shoved Marshall backward, breaking her sight picture entirely. "Shot out," she gasped, fighting to pull the rifle back into her shoulder and find the scope again. 4 seconds, Miller said, staring through the spotting scope. 1001. Marshall found the cliff face in her scope. 1002. The DSHK gunner was leaning back into the weapon, preparing to fire. 1003. The wind in the valley shifted, whipping a dust devil across the canyon floor. I missed. The wind took it. I missed. 1004. Down on the cliff, 2.5 kilometers away, the DSHK gunner's head snapped violently backward, as if he'd been hit by an invisible truck. A millisecond later, his upper torso crumpled forward over the spade grips of the heavy machine gun. Dead before the sound of the gunshot even began to echo down the canyon walls. Miller exhaled a breath that sounded like a sob. Impact. Center mass. Target is down. Marshall didn't celebrate. Her hands were shaking violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting her nervous system like a sledgehammer. She tasted copper. She realized she had bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to draw blood. "Reloading," she said, her voice shaking. She racked the bolt, the smoking brass casing tumbling onto the rocks. "Miller, find me the next one. We aren't done yet." Gunpowder always left a film on the teeth. It tasted bitter, a chemical blend of sulfur and burnt carbon that settled in the back of the throat and refused to wash away. Marshall spat a glob of dry, white saliva onto the limestone beside her elbow. Her right shoulder throbbed with a deep, bruised ache. The TAC-50 didn't push when you fired it. It punched. It was a violent, mechanical collision of bone and polymer, and she had just invited it to happen again. Down in the valley, the sudden death of the DSHK gunner had created a vacuum. For 3 beautiful, agonizing seconds, the heavy thump, thump, thump that had been tearing the wadi apart simply ceased. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope, the world was magnified and terrifyingly intimate. Marshall watched the dead gunner slump forward, his blood pooling dark and slick on the sun-baked sandbags. The insurgent beside him, the loader, froze. He was young, maybe 19, wearing a faded blue tracksuit top under a chest rig. He stared at his comrade's ruined torso, his brain struggling to process the geometry of a sniper shot that came from nowhere. "He's going for the grips," Miller rasped. His eye was jammed against the spotting scope. Marshall saw it too. The paralysis broke. The kid in the tracksuit shoved the dead man aside, his hands reaching for the wooden spade grips of the heavy machine gun. He didn't know where the shot had come from, but he knew where the Americans were trapped. "Hold is the same," Miller said, his voice flat, professional, masking the frantic spike of his own pulse. "Wind hasn't shifted. Send it when you have it." Marshall exhaled. The crosshairs dropped down to the bottom of the mil-dot grid again, aiming at the empty sky above the cliff. She didn't have to calculate this time. The math was already done. Now it was just muscle memory and the refusal to let the kid in the tracksuit pull that trigger. She pressed through the wall of the 2-stage trigger. The rifle roared, bucking violently. The concussion kicked up another cloud of white dust, momentarily blinding her. Her collarbone screamed in protest. "Shot out," she muttered, forcing the rifle back into her shoulder, fighting the recoil to get her eye back in the optic. 1001, 1002, 1003. Down in the canyon, the kid in the tracksuit grabbed the grips. He never got to squeeze them. The heavy .50 caliber slug impacted the feed tray of the DSHK, missing the kid by a fraction of an inch. The kinetic energy of the massive round striking the Soviet steel was catastrophic. The machine gun shattered. Shrapnel and exploding ammunition ripped outward. The kid in the tracksuit was thrown backward, disappearing in a cloud of grey smoke and flying rock. "Target neutralized. Gun is destroyed," Miller said. He pulled his head away from the spotting scope and looked at Marshall. For a second, the hardened operator facade cracked. His eyes were wide, bloodshot from the glare. "Holy shit, Marshall." Marshall didn't smile. She didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, hollow knot in her stomach that was rapidly filling with dread. The heavy gun was down, but the valley was still swarming. "Overwatch, Viper 1, Hayes's voice broke through the static. It sounded wet, weak. "Good hits. DSHK is down, but they're moving. We have multiple elements bounding down the western slope. They know we're stuck." "Viper 1, this is Overwatch." Miller keyed his mic. "We see them. Shift your perimeter. Keep your heads down. We're going to try and buy you some time." "How much time?" Marshall asked, her eyes scanning the jagged terrain of the western slope. Miller checked his watch. "QRF is 30 minutes out. Apaches are grounded at Bagram due to a sandstorm pushing south. It's just us." 30 minutes. In a firefight, 30 minutes was a lifetime. It was an eternity of dwindling ammunition, bleeding wounds, and the slow, suffocating realization that the math was no longer on your side. Marshall found the first bounding element. 3 men moving fast through a narrow ravine that fed into the main wadi. They were smart. They were using the dead space, staying out of direct line of sight of Hayes and his men. But from Marshall's elevated position, they were exposed. "Range," Marshall demanded. 1,800 meters, Miller said, instantly back in the glass. Elevation drop is 70 feet. Wind is tricky here. You've got an updraft coming out of that ravine. Hold 1/2 mil low, 2 mils left. Marshall dialed her turrets. The clicks felt loud in the quiet of their hide. She found the lead runner in her crosshairs. He was carrying an RPG-7, the olive-drab warhead bobbing up and down as he sprinted. "Leading target," she said. She tracked the runner, keeping the crosshairs just ahead of his chest. It felt unnatural. You weren't supposed to shoot where the man was. You had to shoot where he was going to be in 3 seconds. She exhaled. She squeezed. The rifle kicked. The brass flew. "Miss," Miller called. "Impact just behind his heel. You didn't lead him enough?" The RPG gunner stopped, looking back at the dust plume kicked up by the near miss. It was a fatal mistake. "Correction," Marshall said, chambering another round. Her shoulder was beginning to ache with a dull, throbbing intensity. "Same hold," Miller said. "He's stationary." Marshall didn't wait. She settled the crosshairs, exhaled, and fired. The heavy round caught the RPG gunner in the chest. At 1,800 meters, the bullet had lost a significant amount of its velocity, but it was still a massive piece of metal moving faster than the speed of sound. The man dropped instantly, the RPG clattering against the rocks. The other 2 insurgents scrambled for cover, diving behind a boulder. "They're pinned," Miller said, "but they're calling it in. The whole valley knows we're up here now." "B?" Marshall wiped a mixture of sweat and sunscreen from her eye. The salt stung. "Let them know," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It just means they have to look up." Shadows in the mountains do not stretch. They crawl. They slithered down the limestone faces like bruised purple fingers, dropping the temperature in the valley by 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. Up on the ridge, the sun was still a punishing, blinding white orb, baking the back of Marshall's neck. The contrast was nauseating. Her head pounded with a dull, rhythmic thud that perfectly matched her pulse. Her shoulder was no longer just aching, it felt structural, like something deep inside the joint had spider-webbed. She had fired 12 rounds in the last 20 minutes. 12 rounds from a .50 caliber rifle in rapid succession was a recipe for microfractures and a detached retina. She blinked hard, trying to clear the fuzzy grey static creeping into the edges of her vision. "Drink," Miller commanded. He didn't ask. He shoved the bite valve of his camelback against her cheek. Marshall didn't pull her eye from the scope, but she turned her head a fraction and bit down on the rubber valve. The water was hot, tasting strongly of plastic and the iodine tablets they'd dropped in it 2 days ago. It was vile, but she swallowed greedily, feeling the dry sponge of her throat desperately absorb the moisture. "They're getting smarter," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, returning to the low, raspy whisper he used when things were going entirely off the rails. They realized they can't cross the open ground. They're using the caves, moving through the subterranean network and popping out in the dead space right above Hayes. Through the glass, Marshall scanned the cliff face directly above the wadi where the SEAL squad was trapped. It looked like Swiss cheese, a labyrinth of natural fissures and ancient man-made tunnels. "Overwatch Carter," the radio crackled. The panic in the young SEAL's voice was gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollow exhaustion. "Hayes is passed out. Tourniquet is holding, but he lost a lot of blood. Dawson's gone, man. He stopped breathing 10 minutes ago." The silence on the ridge was heavier than the rifle. Marshall's finger tightened on the trigger guard. She felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger. Not at the insurgents, not at the command post sitting in their air-conditioned trailers. She was angry at the rocks. She was angry at the wind. She was angry at the inescapable, cold physics of the universe that allowed a young kid from Ohio to bleed to death in the dirt while she watched from 2 miles away. "Copy that, Carter," Miller said. His voice betrayed nothing. It was a perfectly calm, professional lie. "Hold your perimeter. QRF is 15 mics out. Fast movers are inbound. Just keep your heads down." Miller cut the mic and looked at Marshall. "Dawson's KIA." "I heard," she said. Her jaw was clamped so tight her teeth ached. "Look at grid reference Delta Niner," Miller instructed, returning to his spotting scope. Marshall shifted the heavy barrel. Her muscles trembled with fatigue. The rifle, which had felt like an extension of her body an hour ago, now felt like an anvil she was forced to balance on a tightrope. She found the grid reference. It was a ledge, maybe 50 feet directly above the rock outcropping, where Carter, Riggs, and the unconscious Hayes were hiding. 3 insurgents were creeping out of a cave mouth onto the ledge. They were carrying woven wicker baskets. "What is that?" Marshall muttered. Miller zoomed in. "Grenades. They're going to drop fragmentation grenades right on top of them. A vertical plunge. Hayes won't even have cover from above." "Range," Marshall snapped. 1,200 meters, Miller said. "It's a steep downward angle. You'll hit high if you don't compensate for the slope. Hold under. 1 mil down." Marshall dialed the scope. At 1,200 meters, the shot was practically point blank compared to what she had been doing. But the angle was a nightmare. She was shooting down into a bowl, the bullet traveling through 3 different thermal layers. She found the lead insurgent. He was pulling the pin on a Russian F-1-hand grenade, stepping to the edge of the cliff to drop it on the men below. Marshall didn't wait for the perfect breath. She forced her tired eye to focus, held the crosshairs just below his sternum, and ripped the trigger backward. The rifle punished her again, slamming into her bruised shoulder. "Hit," Miller called. Through the dust, kicked up by the muzzle brake, Marshall saw the insurgent fold in half. He dropped straight down, tumbling off the ledge, but he had already pulled the pin. The grenade fell with him. "Grenade!" Miller yelled over the net, abandoning protocol. "Carter, cover!" The explosion was a tiny, dirty puff of smoke halfway down the cliff face. The insurgent had held it too long, or maybe he dropped it on his way down. It detonated in midair, raining harmless shrapnel into the dust 20 feet away from the SEAL's position. "Close," Miller breathed, wiping a streak of grime from his forehead. The other 2 insurgents on the ledge didn't retreat. They threw themselves flat against the rock, realizing the sniper fire was coming from above them, not across the valley. They began low crawling toward the edge, pushing the wicker basket of grenades ahead of them. "They're crawling," Marshall said. "I can't get a clean angle. The rock lip is blocking their center mass." "You don't need center mass," Miller said, his eyes hard. "Shoot the rock. Shoot the basket. Shoot whatever you can see. Keep them back." Marshall chambered her 14th round. The barrel of the TAC-50 was radiating heat, distorting the air in front of her scope. The mirage was getting worse. The target was a blurry, swimming shape of tan and brown against grey stone. She fired. The heavy bullet struck the limestone lip just inches from the insurgents' heads. The impact shattered the rock, sending razor-sharp fragments of stone exploding outward like secondary shrapnel. One of the men screamed, clutching his face, rolling backward into the cave mouth. The other insurgent panicked. He grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and blindly chucked it over the edge without looking. "Incoming!" Miller yelled over the radio. The grenade bounced off the canyon wall, deflecting outward, and detonated in the wadi, 50 yards away from Carter's position. A useless throw, driven by blind terror. Marshall racked the bolt again. The metallic shuck-clack was the only sound she trusted anymore. Her shoulder was numb. Her eye felt like it was full of sand. "QRF is 10 minutes out," Miller said, looking at his screen. "Fast movers are entering the airspace. They're asking for targets." Marshall stared through the scope. The valley floor was littered with bodies. The DSHK was a twisted ruin of metal. The ledge above Hayes was empty, save for the bloodstains baking into the rock. "Tell them," Marshall said, her voice a hollow, raspy whisper, "to hit the western ridgeline, all of it, burn it down." She didn't lower the rifle. She couldn't. Her muscles had locked into position, frozen by adrenaline, fear, and the absolute certainty that if she blinked, someone else would die. She watched the dust settle in the wadi, waiting for the next muzzle flash, waiting for the next target, trapped in the cold, terrifying math of the high ground. Heat radiates from the barrel of a fired TAC-50 in thick, shimmering waves, distorting the air like cheap glass. Marshall blinked through the mirage, her right eye bloodshot and stinging from the constant, punishing pressure of the scope's rubber eye cup. Her shoulder was no longer just a source of pain. It had become a localized center of gravity, pulling her entire posture down into the jagged limestone. The rifle was technically a machine, but right now, it felt like a parasite, draining the last reserves of her hydration and adrenaline to feed its violent hunger. Shadows stretched further across the valley floor, turning the baked tan earth into a bruised purple landscape. Down in the wadi, Carter and Riggs had stopped returning fire. They were conserving ammunition. Or they were dead. The radio had been silent for 6 minutes. 6 minutes is an eternity when you're staring through high-powered glass at a battlefield you cannot touch with your hands. "Talk to me, Carter," Miller rasped into his headset. He pressed his hand against his earpiece, trying to block out the howling wind on the ridge. Nothing. Just the faint, rhythmic static of an open mic picking up the ambient noise of a dying canyon. "They're consolidating," Miller said, pulling his eye from the spotting scope. He looked terrible. His face was a mask of grey dust, sweat cutting muddy tracks down his cheeks. "The Insurgents. They know the QRF is coming. They aren't going to try and flank anymore. They're going to erase that grid square before the helicopters get here." Marshall shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp rock digging into her ribcage. "Where?" "Grid reference Echo 4, the dry riverbed feeding into the main wadi. They've dragged something heavy into the dead space." Marshall tracked left. Echo 4 was a deep, natural trench carved by centuries of flash floods. It was completely hidden from their elevated position. From above, it just looked like a shadow beneath a massive, overhanging shelf of sandstone. Then she heard it. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a distinct, hollow thunk. It sounded like a steel pipe being struck with a heavy rubber mallet. "Mortar," Miller said, the color draining completely from his face. 60mm, maybe an 82. They have it set up in the defilade, behind the rock shelf. A second later, the canyon floor 300 yards away from the trapped seals erupted in a geyser of brown dirt and black smoke. The sound of the detonation reached them 3 seconds later, a flat, concussive crump that echoed off the canyon walls. "They're walking it in," Marshall said, her voice dropping to a lifeless monotone. She stared at the rock shelf. "I can't see the tube. I can't see the crew. They are completely masked." Another thunk echoed from the unseen trench. This time, the explosion chewed up a patch of ground only 100 yards from Carter's position. The mortar crew was adjusting their base plate, dialing in the trajectory. They didn't need to see the target. They just needed to bracket the wadi and drop high explosive shells until nothing moved. "Carter!" Miller barked into the radio. "Incoming indirect fire! Get tight to the wall!" "We're as tight as we can get," Carter's voice screamed back. It was the sound of a man who had finally realized the math had caught up to him. "There's nowhere left to go. Make it stop, Overwatch. Make it stop." Marshall stared at the sandstone overhang, hiding the mortar crew. The physics were absolute. A bullet travels in an arc, but it cannot bend around a corner. It cannot phase through 20 feet of solid rock. For the first time since they had crawled onto the ridge, a wave of cold, suffocating helplessness washed over her. She couldn't shoot what she couldn't see. "Miller," she said, her fingers tightening on the pistol grip until her knuckles turned white. "Give me a Raufoss." Miller didn't ask questions. He reached into his chest rig, unfastening a specialized pouch. He pulled out a massive .50 caliber round. The tip of the bullet was painted green with a silver band. It was a Mark 211 Raufoss round. Armor-piercing, explosive, and incendiary. A miniature missile designed to punch through light armor and detonate inside. He handed it to her. The brass casing was cold. Marshall ejected her standard ball ammunition, caught the unfired round before it hit the dirt, and slid the Raufoss into the chamber. The bolt closed with its heavy, reassuring clack. "What's the play?" Miller asked, leaning back into his glass. "I can't hit them," Marshall said, elevating the barrel of the massive rifle. She wasn't aiming at the shadow. She was aiming at the cracked, unstable sandstone overhang jutting out directly above the mortar pit. "But I can hit the ceiling." Miller checked the wind. 1,900 meters. "The rock shelf is structural, Marshall. One round isn't going to bring it down. I'm aiming for the fissure line on the left flank. It looks rotten." Thunk. A third mortar shell left the tube. The weight was agonizing. Time dilated, turning seconds into thick, heavy sludge. The shell detonated 60 yards from the seals, showering their position with pulverized rock and jagged shrapnel. "Send it," Miller said. Marshall breathed out. She let the crosshairs settle on a deep, jagged crack in the sandstone overhang. She didn't calculate wind drift for a center-mass human target. She calculated for a 3-foot patch of ancient geology. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked, driving its kinetic energy straight into her bruised joint. She fought the recoil, snapping her eye back into the optic. At 1,900 meters, the Raufoss round struck the sandstone fissure. It didn't just impact, it penetrated and detonated. A brilliant flash of magnesium fire sparked deep inside the rock face, followed instantly by a puff of pulverized stone. For a second, nothing happened. Then, physics took over. The explosion compromised the already fragile structural integrity of the ancient shelf. A web of cracks shot outward from the impact zone. With a sound like a crumbling skyscraper, a massive section of the sandstone overhang detached. Thousands of pounds of jagged rock sheared away from the cliff face, plummeting directly into the trench below. The avalanche hit the hidden mortar pit with devastating force. A cloud of thick brown dust billowed out from the defilade, choking the air. There was no explosion, just the sickening sound of tons of stone crushing everything beneath it. The hollow thunk of the mortar tube did not sound again. Miller exhaled a long, ragged breath. "Target destroyed. The pit is buried." Marshall racked the bolt, the empty Raufoss casing spinning out into the dirt. She didn't feel victorious. She felt nauseous. Her hands were shaking again, a fine, uncontrollable tremor in her fingertips. She had just dropped a mountain on a group of men. The sheer scale of the violence was beginning to seep through the psychological walls she had built around herself. But the battlefield didn't care about her walls. Dust is a traitor. It reveals everything. The massive cloud of pulverized rock from the collapsed shelf acted like a beacon, drawing the eyes of every surviving insurgent in the valley. They couldn't see the sniper hide, but they saw the angle of the destruction. They saw the math. They realized the death wasn't coming from the weights, it was coming from the sky. "Marshal," Miller said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "They see us." Through the scope, Marshal saw the shift in momentum. Down on the canyon floor, figures were standing up from behind their cover. They weren't looking at Carter and Riggs anymore. They were looking directly up at the eastern ridge. "Muzzle flashes," Miller barked. The western wall of the canyon began to sparkle. It looked like a string of cheap Christmas lights, short-circuiting in the fading sun. Suddenly the air around them snapped. It was a sharp, aggressive crack, like a bullwhip being cracked right next to her ear. It was the sound of a bullet breaking the sound barrier as it passed within inches of her skull. The insurgents were firing blindly at the ridge, walking their bursts up the limestone face. Crack, crack, crack. A burst of PKM machine gun fire chewed into the rock 3 feet below their hide. Jagged splinters of limestone exploded upward, showering them in sharp, stinging debris. "Keep your head down," Miller yelled, flattening himself against the abrasive stone. Marshal didn't flinch, though every instinct in her nervous system screamed at her to bury her face in the dirt. She kept her eye glued to the scope. She had a heavy weapon, and she needed to establish superiority before the insurgents realized how few snipers were actually on the ridge. She found a PKM gunner firing from the hip, leaning around a boulder. She didn't wait for Miller's call. She guessed the wind, bracketed the drop, and fired. The recoil punished her, but she saw the gunner drop his weapon, clutching his thigh as the heavy round severed his femoral artery. Crack, zing. A ricochet whined off the rock right between her and Miller. A terrifying, cartoonish sound that meant death had just missed them by millimeters. "Ah, shit," Miller grunted. Marshal broke her sight picture and looked right. Miller was clutching the side of his face. Blood was seeping through his thick fingers, a bright, startling crimson against the pale dust covering his skin. A fragment of limestone, blasted loose by an incoming round, had caught him just above the cheekbone. I'm fine," Miller hissed, batting her hand away as she reached for her medkit. He blinked rapidly, blood dripping into his eye. "It's a scratch. Gets in the eye, though. I can't see the glass." He pushed the spotting scope away, effectively blinding their team. A sniper without a spotter is just a person with a heavy gun, blind to the variables of the environment. "I need you on the radio," Marshal said, her voice tight but remarkably steady. She chambered another round. "Get the fast movers, now." Miller fumbled for the radio handset with his bloody hand. "Viper Command, this is Overwatch. We are taking heavy direct fire. Target grid is hot. Where the hell is our air support?" The radio cracked with the sterile, calm voice of an AWACS controller, orbiting 30,000 feet above them. "Overwatch, this is Boar 11, 2F/A18S, entering your airspace. We have your coordinates, but we have no visual on the enemy. The dust in the valley is too thick for targeting pods. We need a laser designation or a smoke mark. Over." Miller looked at Marshal. "They can't see them. The rock slide kicked up too much dust." Marshal looked down into the valley. It was a cauldron of swirling brown smog. The insurgents were firing blindly through it, their muzzle flashes illuminating the dust like lightning in a storm cloud. She couldn't see them clearly, but she knew where the highest concentration of fire was coming from. The cave network on the western wall. "I can't mark it with the rifle," Marshal said. I don't have tracers loaded, and it won't be sustained enough for the targeting pods. Miller grabbed a heavy, blocky piece of equipment from his pack. The SOFLM, Special Operations Forces Laser Acquisition Marker. It looked like a pair of oversized, futuristic binoculars. I can't hold it steady, Miller said, his hands shaking from the adrenaline and the blood pooling in his eye. You have to do it. Marshall looked at the SOFLAM, then at her rifle. If she let go of the TAC-50, she was completely defenseless. She would be standing up, exposed to the withering fire hitting the ridge, holding nothing but a plastic box that emitted an invisible beam of light. Crack snap. A bullet hit the dirt just above her boot, throwing sand over her legs. Do it, Miller grunted, shoving the designator toward her. I'll try to suppress with the M4. Miller pulled his standard assault rifle, leaning over the edge of the rock, and began firing short, controlled bursts into the smog below. It was a pitiful amount of fire compared to the heavy weapons the insurgents were using, but it was all they had. Marshall pushed the TAC-50 aside. She grabbed the SOFLAM. It felt bizarrely light in her hands. She pushed herself up onto her knees. The moment her head cleared the rock ledge, the volume of incoming fire doubled. The air was thick with supersonic cracks and the terrifying heavy thuds of bullets chewing into the limestone around her. She forced herself to ignore it. She forced herself to become a statue. She pressed her eyes against the rubber cups of the designator. The thermal imaging cut through the dust like a knife. The western wall lit up with the bright white heat signatures of dozens of insurgents clustered in the cave mouths. She centered the crosshairs of the SOFLAM on the largest cluster of heat signatures. Lasing, she said, squeezing the trigger on the device. An invisible infrared laser shot across the valley, painting the cave entrance. Bore 1-1, Miller yelled into the radio. Target designated, western wall, grid reference, Delta 6. Copy, Overwatch, the pilot's voice came back, shockingly calm against the backdrop of gunfire. Tally on the laser, stand by, weapons away, time on target, 20 seconds. 20 seconds. Marshall knelt there, exposed, holding the laser steady. The muscles in her core screamed in protest. Every fiber of her being wanted to dive back into the dirt. A bullet snapped so close to her ear that she felt the pressure wave shift her hair. Hold it, Marshall, Miller yelled, firing another burst from his M4. Hold it. 10 seconds. The heat signatures in the thermal view were moving, firing blindly at the ridge. They didn't know they were already dead. They didn't know that thousands of pounds of high explosives were currently falling out of the sky, guided by a beam of light held by a terrified, exhausted woman kneeling in the dirt. 5 seconds. A high-pitched, tearing sound ripped through the sky above them. It sounded like the fabric of reality was being unzipped. It was the sound of the bomb cutting through the atmosphere. Down! Miller screamed. Marshall dropped the SOFLAM and threw herself face first into the limestone, covering her neck with her hands. The F/A-18 dropped a 2,000-pound JDAM directly onto the laser designation. The explosion didn't make a sound at first. It was a physical force, a massive, invisible hand that shoved the air out of Marshall's lungs and pressed her violently against the rock. The shockwave hit them a fraction of a second before the noise. When the sound did hit, it was apocalyptic. It wasn't a bang. It was a deep, earth-shattering roar that shook the ridge so violently Marshall felt her teeth chatter. The entire western wall of the canyon seemed to detach and dissolve into a blinding flash of orange fire and black smoke. Debris rained down on them a few seconds later, small pebbles and dust drifting over the ridge like dirty snow. Marshall lay there, her face pressed against the abrasive limestone. She smelled cordite, vaporized rock, and her own sweat. Her ears were ringing with a high, constant whine that drowned out everything else. She didn't move. She just breathed, feeling the rough texture of the grit coating the roof of her mouth, waiting to see if the world was still there, dirt pressed into the pores of her cheek. It felt like tiny, hot needles. Her ears emitted a high, synthetic whine, blocking out the wind, the radio, and the groan of the earth settling. She blinked, and a crust of mud, sweat mixed with pulverized sandstone, flaked off her eyelashes, falling onto the shattered limestone beneath her face. Miller was a blurry, heaving shape beside her. His mouth was moving, forming sharp, frantic shapes, but the words were completely lost in the agonizing ring drowning out her eardrums. He reached out and shoved her shoulder. Not a gentle check, a hard, panicked strike to see if she was still anchored to the living. Marshall flinched, pulling her knees up into her chest, coughing violently. The air was no longer composed of oxygen. It was a thick, abrasive soup of vaporized rock, cordite, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. She tasted blood. Not copper this time, but the thick, warm reality of a bitten tongue. Slowly, as if turning the dial on a broken radio, the audio of the world bled back in. "Win! Marshall, look at me!" Miller's voice was hoarse, tearing through the ringing in her ears. He had a trauma dressing pressed against the side of his face, the white gauze already blooming with a heavy red circle. "I'm up," she croaked. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. She pushed herself onto her elbows, instantly regretting it. Her right shoulder didn't flare with pain. It simply ceased to function, locked in a deep, agonizing cramp that radiated down to her fingertips. "The valley," Miller gasped, nodding toward the edge of the cliff. "Look." Marshall dragged herself forward, her boots scraping weakly against the stone. She didn't bother with the spotting scope. She grabbed the TAC-50, hauling the heavy weapon up with her left hand, and jammed her eye against the optic. The western wall of the canyon was simply gone. Where the caves had been, a massive, jagged crater now scarred the cliff face. It looked as though a colossal fist had punched through the limestone. Black smoke poured from the fissures, thick and greasy. The thermal updrafts were catching the smoke, spinning it into dirty tornadoes that choked the wadi below. Nothing moved on the western ridge. There were no muzzle flashes. There were no running figures. There was only the absolute, devastating finality of a 2,000-pound bomb. "Viper Command, Overwatch," Miller barked into his headset. He winced, blood leaking past his bandage. "Good hits. Target is obliterated. QRF, what is your ETA? We have men bleeding out in the dirt." "Overwatch, this is Romeo 6. A new voice crackled over the net. The heavy rhythmic chopping of rotor blades bled through the transmission. "We have visual on the smoke. 2 pavehawks pushing your grid. ETA is 2 mics. Popping flares." Down in the valley, a single, sputtering stream of purple smoke hissed into the air from Carter's position. It was a weak, pitiful marker, bleeding out from behind the jagged rocks where the squad was pinned. But it was the most beautiful thing Marshall had ever seen. It meant someone down there still had hands to pull a pin. 2 dark shapes crested the southern ridgeline, dropping violently into the canyon like predatory birds. The MH-60G pavehawks flared their noses, their miniguns swiveling outward, scanning the smoke-filled ruins of the western wall. But there was nothing left to shoot. Marshall rested her forehead against the cool polymer stock of her rifle. She should have felt relief. She should have felt the triumphant rush of survival. Instead, she felt hollowed out. A cold, heavy void expanded in her chest. She had pulled the trigger 15 times. She had executed the math flawlessly. She had manipulated wind, drop and pressure to end human lives at an impossible distance. But math doesn't bring anyone back. "They're landing," Miller said, his voice finally losing its tension, collapsing into exhaustion. Through the scope, Marshall watched the lead helicopter hover over the wadie, its massive rotors kicking up a hurricane of dust. Pararescue men in green flight suits jumped from the skids before the wheels even touched the dirt, sprinting towards the purple smoke. They reached Carter first. He was slumped against the rocks, his rifle lying in the dirt, his helmet gone. He pointed frantically toward Hayes and Riggs. Marshall watched a PJ kneel over a fourth figure lying perfectly still beneath a thermal blanket. The medic didn't try to administer an IV. He didn't start chest compressions. He simply lifted the edge of the blanket, checked a pulse out of protocol, and gently pulled the reflective material back over Dawson's face. Marshall closed her eyes. The crosshairs of the scope remained burned into her retina, a glowing green cross in the darkness of her own mind. "Overwatch Romeo 6, the radio chirped. "We have the package. 3 alive, 1 KIA. We're sending the second bird up to your ridge to pull you off this rock. Prepare for extraction." "Copy, Romeo," Miller said, spitting a mouthful of grit onto the limestone. He looked at Marshall. "Pack it up. We're going home." Marshall didn't answer. She mechanically began clearing her weapon. She dropped the magazine, the heavy metal clattering against the rock. She pulled the bolt back, catching the live round in her palm. The brass was cold now. The violence was over. She slipped the round into her pocket, not as a souvenir, but as a heavy, dragging reminder of the weight she was carrying. Aviation fuel smells like burnt kerosene and metallic adrenaline. It washed over the ridge, drowning out the scent of ozone and blood, as the second pavehawk flared 50 feet above their sniper hide. The rotor wash hit them like a physical blow, tearing at their loose gear, throwing blinding sheets of white limestone dust into the air. Marshall stood up. Her legs wobbled, the muscles trembling so violently she almost pitched forward over the cliff edge. Miller grabbed the webbing of her tactical vest with his good hand, steadying her. "I got you," he yelled over the deafening roar of the twin turbine engines. "Let's go." The crew chief in the door of the helicopter aggressively waved them forward. Marshall slung the massive TAC-50 over her back. The strap bit viciously into her bruised collarbone, a sharp, white-hot agony that finally snapped her out of her emotional paralysis. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain, and limped toward the aircraft. They scrambled into the cabin, collapsing onto the canvas jump seats. The metal floor vibrated with immense mechanical power. Before they were even strapped in, the pilot pulled pitch, and the helicopter banked hard to the left, dropping sickeningly over the edge of the canyon. Marshall grabbed the cargo netting to keep from sliding. The valley rushed up to meet them, a chaotic blur of tan rock and black smoke. The bird plummeted into the wadi to link up with the lead chopper, which was just lifting off with Hayes's squad. The interior of the pavehawk was sweltering, smelling of hydraulic fluid and old sweat. Marshall sat in the dim, red tactical lighting, staring at her boots. She didn't want to look out the window. She didn't want to see the crater on the western wall. She didn't want to see the blood stains on the rocks where the DSHK gunner had fallen. Miller slumped against the bulkhead beside her. A medic was already working on him, peeling the hasty gauze away from his face to examine the deep, jagged gash near his eye. Miller didn't wince. He just stared blankly at the ceiling of the cabin, lost in his own post-combat decompression. The two helicopters flew in tight formation, banking violently through the twisting canyon, racing toward the safety of altitude. "Hey!" a voice cracked over the internal comms system. Marshall looked up. Across the narrow cabin, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the door gunner, was Carter. He had been cross-loaded onto their bird. The young SEAL looked nothing like the squared-away operator who had fast-roped into the valley that morning. His uniform was torn to shreds, plastered to his body with dark, dried blood, most of it not his own. His face was a mask of grey exhaustion, his eyes wide and haunted. He held his helmet in his lap, his knuckles white as he gripped the Kevlar. Between Carter's boots rested a long, heavy nylon bag, black, impervious to the dust, zipped tight. Marshall stared at the bag. The zipper pull was small, silver, and perfectly still. It was a jarring, clinical object in a world of ragged, torn flesh and broken rocks. Dawson, the kid who made terrible coffee at the FOB, the radio man who had been laughing about a girl in San Diego 12 hours ago. Carter followed her gaze down to the bag, then looked back up at her. He didn't offer a slow, cinematic nod. He didn't mouth the words, "Thank you." The military didn't work like movies. There was no triumphant score playing in the background. There was just the deafening scream of the transmission, the smell of kerosene, and the crushing weight of survival. Carter just stared at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears and unchecked trauma. Marshall held his gaze. She didn't look away. It was the hardest thing she had done all day, harder than the 2,500-meter shot, harder than holding the laser designator while bullets chewed the rock around her face. She absorbed Carter's grief, letting it settle into her own hollow chest. She reached slowly across the vibrating floor of the helicopter. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand on the thick nylon of the body bag, right over where Dawson's shoulder would be. Carter watched her hand, then slowly reached out and placed his own hand next to hers. They sat there in the dim red light as the helicopter breached the canyon rim, rising into the cold, thin air of the Afghan mountains. The heat of the valley faded, replaced by a biting chill that seeped through their sweat-soaked uniforms. Marshall leaned back against the canvas seat. Her hand remained on the bag. The TAC-50 leaned heavily against her knee, entirely useless now. The brass casing from the final, impossible shot sat heavy in her pocket. The math was over. The physics were done. All that was left was the deeply human, unforgiving silence of the ride home. War strips away the glory and leaves only the brutal, mechanical truth of survival. Marshall's 2,500-meter shot wasn't a miracle. It was cold physics, executed by a human pushed past the breaking point. If this raw, unfiltered look into the reality of modern combat kept your heart racing, hit that like button and share this video with someone who respects the grit it takes to pull the trigger. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories from the front lines. What did you think of Marshall's impossible math? Drop a comment below. Would you have held the line?